Decorative cuts with a swivel knife are generally going to be the final step of the tooling process, but this is not only an opportunity to add a lot more detail to our designs. Adding these freehand cuts gives us the opportunity to really hone in on our own style, put your own twist on things, and really set your work apart from other makers. But before we get started, I want to let it be known that there are no hard set rules around decorative cuts. Just like I mentioned, everybody has their own style and preferences around it. These are typically going to be freehand cuts. You don't have any lines to follow. They're just the final touches that you add to your project, and you can do it however you want. Everybody does it differently. I have my own preferences and habits, if you will, around certain decorative cuts that I apply to my work. But I am always mixing it up. I'm trying different things on my flowers, my feathers, my vine work. So in this video, I'm just going to share with you some of my thoughts and ideas around decorative cuts and share with you some very basic tips that have helped me along the way and hopefully can give you a little bit more confidence with your decorative cuts going forward. First things first, let's take a look at the tool we're actually going to be using. This is a swivel knife. This is a Berry King swivel knife. And what I have in this is a 1/4 inch thin blade with a 3/8 inch barrel, and this is the swivel knife that I use for everything. Now some people will get bigger blades for different purposes or smaller blades, but I make this blade work for literally everything that I do, from all of my carving, my decorative cuts, so on and so forth. Now take a look at the anatomy of this knife and no, this is not the knife that cut my finger. Of all things, I cut my finger doing the dishes, but that's besides the point. This is the cradle where your finger sits, and now you have free flowing movement. Keep this in mind as we go throughout this video, because getting comfortable with this motion is going to help improve your decorative cuts drastically. When it comes to caring for this blade, I honestly rarely ever actually sharpen my swivel knife, but I do keep it polished often. So what I have here is just a scrap piece of leather, and apparently I tooled on it, but this is the rough side or the flesh side of the leather, and I just rubbed some jeweler's rouge. I have this white and this green polishing compound. I don't really know the difference in that. I'm not an expert on that, but I just rub that polishing compound in on the rough side of that leather until it starts to build up. And every so often, especially if you start to feel your knife dragging in the leather, I do it before that. I'm constantly stropping this blade, where I am just taking it across that jeweler's rouge or that polishing compound, keeping any little burrs or buildup off of that knife and making sure that it cuts smoothly through the leather. And when you're stropping these swivel knives, always make sure to try and maintain the angle of the tip of that blade while you're running it across that piece of leather or however you're deciding to strop it, because if you start to roll it up or really wear that tip down, you'll take away the sharpness of that blade. So always try to maintain the little angle that you see on the tip of that blade when you are polishing it. Now this isn't something that everybody necessarily wants to hear, but if you want to get better, you have to just put in the time and practice. You have to get comfortable with your tools. So what I have here is just a piece of scrap leather. This is some Herman Oak natural vegetable tanned leather, and I'm just going to start carving on it and just get comfortable with this tool. Get used to working that movement and really getting that flowing action with your cuts. Now the main thing that you're going to hear pretty much everybody say about decorative cuts, which is like most of the cuts that you're going to be making with a swivel knife, is you want to start deep and slowly fade or taper that line out, as opposed to just having a deep line all the way through or a very faint line like that. It's usually better to start deep and then slowly lighten the pressure and fade it out. That's really going to help accentuate that flowing motion when you start to add these decorative cuts. You're rarely going to have decorative cuts that are straight lines like that. So again, just get used to turning that swivel knife, starting deep, fading those lines out, and just practice. Get used to it. Try to run lines close together but not run them into each other. That's not very pretty, but we're just cutting and having fun now. Just practice with different things. Practice fading your lines out, the very basic movements of the swivel knife. Just get comfortable with it, because again, that's how you're going to improve. You got to take the time to work at it. And if you're brand new to all of this, this leather does have moisture in it. I have misted it down with water, and it's been sitting here for a little bit, so it is properly cased up. And when I'm going to actually place this knife on the leather to make the cut, I'm not just setting that blade straight down like that. I have it tipped to where only one side of the blade is actually touching the leather, and when you go to make your cut, you want to have that tip to it and then work it. If you have it flat like that, it's not really going to work. This tip right here will get caught. And even if you do have it tipped like that, when you start to make some movements sometime, you don't want to come down and get too steep like that, because then you can start to scrape the leather and the cut's going to be inconsistent. As you can see there, if that will show very well. So we're gonna put that tip in there and then slowly just work the knife. And I'm not really trying to pull it with my arm so much. I am just, again, working this yoke and letting the knife do all of the work. And that is one of the biggest things that has helped me out, is letting the knife do the work rather than trying to force it. I just turn it and let it cut through the leather as I'm turning it instead of trying to guide it so much. And a lot of times when you're making your decorative cuts, your lines are going to be flowing fairly close to one another. So it's always good to practice carving different lines and trying to bring the taper of the lines flowing to a similar spot and in the same direction, and getting as close to you as you can to one another without actually running into another line like that. So it's good to practice running your lines and fading them out pretty close together while not actually bumping into one another. And practice both ways, because you're not always going to have a perfect setup. So I'm more comfortable carving right to left like that, but going left to right sometimes gives me a challenge. So I could probably work at it more. As you can see, I'm not as comfortable running those lines close together. So a few key things up to this point. We want to make sure that we're keeping that blade sharp and polished so that it is cutting smoothly and cleanly through the leather. On those lines, we like to start deep, and then as you go to finish that cut, lighten the pressure, fade or taper that line out into nothing. Get used to cutting lines in different directions, running them close together without running into each other, and just really get used to this swivel motion of this knife. This will go a long ways. The knife will do its job if we allow it to. Don't try to force anything. I know it's a really awkward tool to get used to with your finger up in the cradle like that and then holding it down here. However you want to hold it right here is completely up to you. I usually have it with my thumb and these two fingers, and just get used to working it like that. You can do it, but you got to put the time in. So all of those basics we just covered are pretty much the fundamentals of running a swivel knife and how to create clean cuts within leather. But when it comes to the actual application of decorative cuts, there's no rules. The where and the how is completely up to you. So whether we're talking about dressing out a full floral layout, cutting up your leaves, flowers, and vines, or there's also some geometric patterns out there where there are some ways that you can dress up those patterns with decorative cuts. Or maybe you're doing some figure carving where you're tooling some animals in a project and you're wanting to add details to really show how that animal is structured. Or you could be doing a scene, like a cool desert scene, or the layout of a house. Or when it comes to letters, there are so many different ways that you can use decorative cuts to spice up your letters. So just think of it like how you apply your decorative cuts within a project kind of becomes your signature, and there's so many different ways that you can go about it. So just keep all of that in mind. If you've watched any of my content in the past, then you've probably picked up on some of my tendencies around decorative cuts and how I, more times than not, go about adding them to projects. Now, floral work like this is what I typically do, and so this is more times than not the work that you're going to see me completing. And this is just another piece of Herman oak. This is an old practice piece that I found in my scrap bin. I think I made a video using this piece before, which is why it already has some stuff done to it. But I'm just going to go ahead and show you how I would kind of dress up a pattern like this with decorative cuts in the final stages. Earlier in the video, I did say that these are freehand cuts and you're usually not going to have any lines to follow, but you actually can go through and plan these decorative cuts out. Now, when I'm drawing my patterns out with pencil and leather or pencil and paper, on my flowers and my leaves, I almost always add these little pencil marks that you can faintly see on this old pattern to highlight where I want these petals to flow, like the direction that they're going to flow. And that is kind of me planning for how I want my decorative cuts to go. So you actually can go through and add pencil marks or guidelines on your scrolls, your vine work, or flower petals, or anything like that. If that would help you out, by all means do that. Another thing I want to touch on very briefly is the moisture content. So being that this is the final step of the tooling process, your leather is more than likely going to be a little bit on the drier side. Unless you just completely fully case this out, then it's more than likely going to be a little bit dry. You can go through and re-wet the surface of that leather, but you want to let that soak in and let that leather come back to its natural color before you start carving on it. You don't want this to be too wet, because just like I've said in an earlier video, when your leather is too wet, you are going to get those inconsistent or maybe accidental too deep of cuts with your swivel knife. So proper moisture content goes a long ways with this as well. So as you can tell on my stickers, this is generally my go-to when it comes to the decorative cuts on these. So whether it's a project like this where you can see the full sticker, or sometimes on my belts I might have a border running along the tip and my stickers might be cut off where you can't necessarily see the point, but I almost always run the same skeleton shape of that sticker. So you have the long main body of that sticker coming down here, and then the top part connects to the other piece of the flowing element right here. And so my decorative cuts generally follow that same idea, with this inner line just kind of flowing down this inside right here. And then if you look really close, none of these lines are ever connecting. I'm just again running it really close and then following that same structure where it has this kind of flowing motion along the top and then just ending right there. And that's pretty much my go-to on stickers, just simple little pointy vine work like this. It's very simple. And then as we go over here, this is kind of an acanthus leaf type element. And here lately I've really been liking these, not necessarily parallel, but these side-by-side lines, kind of like I showed earlier in the video, where you kind of make a cut and then flow another cut beside it where they're not ever touching. I think that adds a really cool look to these elements, so I've been doing that a lot more here recently too. On these bigger scrolls like this, you can leave them blank if you want, or sometimes you can just run a little simple decorative cut right down the center of that to kind of highlight that flow, or you can do almost like another little vine structure right here with some other lines flowing into that, or sometimes I like to just run it along the outside, but I like to break it up. I don't like it to just be one long line. I personally think it looks a little bit better when it has that little broken spot in it. That's just me. And there's a lot of ways you can go about tackling these scrolls. You can fan some tools around these and then highlight those with these decorative cuts. This is just a plain scroll with decorative cuts only. And a lot of these, you can see I did shade these. There are a lot of times where I will just leave some little bitty spaces like this plain where I won't do any shading, and I will just let the decorative cuts highlight that alone. And I don't think that looks bad at all. In fact, when I'm doing really tiny or intricate work, I usually like to not shade as much, and like I just said, let those decorative cuts highlight everything more so than the shading normally would. When it comes to flower petals, there's a lot of different ways that you can highlight these with different styles of decorative cuts. I'm going to show you my normal go-to, and then I'll throw a couple extra styles in as well just to give you more of an idea about how you can go about it. So more times than not, if you've seen any of my work, then you can probably spot that this is my go-to. I don't know why, I've just always liked the look of having a big long line coming out the middle of those petals and then just some accent lines, kind of thinner flowing lines out next to those. I just have always liked that look, so I normally do that. But these are a few other options that you can go with. These are kind of more traditional styles. However you decide to go about it though on these, you always want to make sure that you're kind of having everything flow out of or towards the center of that flower petal, like those petals are growing out of that flower center, like they're growing from that flower center like it actually would in real life nature. So on these lines you can see every line that I pull back is flowing, not necessarily touching each other, but flowing right down beside each other and working back towards the center of that flower on all of these long flowing lines make their way back to almost a singular point in that flower where they would be blooming out of it. So just keep that in mind as well. I don't do these very often, so they're a little rusty, but I think they look pretty cool. All right, in this clip, I want you to watch the rotation that I'm using on this swivel knife to get that smooth flowing cut. So once again, the knife will do its job if we allow it to. We just got to get out of the way sometimes. Alright guys, it's getting late, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. Thank you for watching. I hope you got some benefit out of that. I'm sure I'll make a lot more videos over this in the future because it is a highly requested topic. But if you have any questions or anything like that or any ideas, drop them in the comments. Let me know what you think. If you did get some benefit out of this video, please like it and consider subscribing to the channel, especially if you want to see more content like this going forward. I do got a lot of cool plans for this year, so stay tuned. Appreciate you guys. Until next time, we'll see you.